Our Lady of the Flowers, Part 9, page 138, by Genet. When the name was in the room, it came to pass that the murderer, abashed, opened up, and there sprang forth like a glory from his pitiable fragments, an altar on which there lay in the roses a woman of light and flesh. The altar undulated on a foul mud into which it sank. The murderer. Darling drew Our Lady toward him, and the better to embrace him, struggled with him briefly. I would like to dream them both in many other positions if, when I closed my eyes, my dream still obeyed my will. But during the day it is disturbed by anxiety about my trial, and in the evening the preliminaries of sleep denude the environs of myself, destroy objects and episodes, leaving me at the edge of sleep as solitary as I was one night in the middle of a stormy and barren heath. Darling, Divine, and Our Lady flee from me at top speed, taking with them the consolation of their existence, which has its being only in me, for they are not content with fleeing. They do away with themselves, dilute themselves in the appalling insubstantiality of my dreams, or rather, of my sleep, and become my sleep. And they melt into the very stuff of my sleep and compose it. I call for help in silence. I make signals with the two arms of my soul, which are softer than algae, not of course to some friend firmly planted on the ground, but to a kind of crystallization of the tenderness whose seeming hardness makes me believe in its eternity. I call out, "Hold me back, fasten me." I break away from a frightful dream, which will go through the darkness of the cells, the darkness of the spirits of the damned, of the gulfs, through the mouths of the guards, the breasts of the judge, and will end by my being swallowed very, very slowly by a giant crocodile, formed by the whiffs of the foul prison air. It is the fear of the trial. Weighing upon my poor shoulders are the dreadful weight of legal justice and the weight of my fate. How many policemen and detectives with their teeth on edge, as is so aptly said, for days and nights were making relentless efforts to unravel the puzzle I had set. And I thought the affair had been shelved, whereas they kept plugging away, busying themselves about me without my being aware of it, working on the Genet material, on the luminous traces of the Genet gestures, working away on me in the darkness. It was a good thing that I raised egoistic masturbation to the dignity of a cult. I have only to begin the gesture with a kind of unclean and supernatural transposition, displacing the truth. Everything within me turns worshipper. The external vision of the props of my desire isolates me, far from the world. Pleasure of the solitary, gesture of solitude that makes you sufficient unto yourself, possessing intimately others who serve your pleasure without their suspecting it. A pleasure that gives to you your most casual gestures, even when you are up and about. That air of supreme indifference toward everyone, and also a certain awkward manner that, if you had gone to bed with a boy, makes you feel as if you have bumped your head against a granite slab. I've got lots of time for making my fingers fly. 10 years to go. My good, my gentle friend, my cell, my sweet retreat, mine alone. I love you so. If I had to live in all freedom in another city, I would first go to prison to acknowledge my own, those of my race, and also to find you there. Yesterday I was summoned by the examining magistrate. From the Santé to the law court, the jolting and the smell of the police van had nauseated me. I appeared before the judge as white as a sheet. As soon as I entered his chambers, I was struck by gloom. despite the dusty secret flowering of the criminal files caused by the presence of the smashed violin that Divine also saw. And because of that Christ, I was open to pity. Because of it and of the dream in which my victim came to forgive me. In fact, the judge smiled at me very kindly. I recognized my victim's smile in my dream and recalled, or realized again, that he himself was supposed to have been both a judge on a bench, whom I confused, perhaps intentionally, with the examining magistrate, and an examining magistrate. Knowing that I had been pardoned by him, feeling tranquil and sure, not with a certainty resulting from logic, but out of a desire for peace, a desire to return to the life of men, the desire that makes Darling serve the police so as to return to his place among human beings through having served order, and at the same time to depart from the human through deliberate baseness. Sure that everything had been forgotten, hypnotized by the pardon, with a sense of confidence, I confessed. The clerk recorded the confession, which I signed. My lawyer was stupefied, staggered. What in the world had I done? Who tricked me? Heaven? Heaven, dwelling of God in his court. I went back through the underground corridors of the court and returned to my dark, icy little cell in the mousetrap, Ariadne in the labyrinth, the most alive of worlds. Human beings with the tenderest flesh are made of marble. I strew devastation as I pass. I wander dead-eyed through cities and petrified populations, but no way out. Impossible to retract the confession, to annul it, to unravel the thread of time that wove it, and to make it unwind and destroy itself. Flee? What an idea! The labyrinth is more torturous than the summing up of judges. What about the guard leading me? A guard of massive bronze, to whom I am chained by the wrist. I quickly concoct a scheme of seducing him, of kneeling before him, first laying my forehead on his thigh, devoutly opening his blue pants. What folly. I'm done for. Why didn't I steal a tube of strychnine from a pharmacy as I'd meant to? I could have kept it on me and concealed it while I was being searched. One day, utterly weary of the land of the chimeras, the only one worth inhabiting, the nothingness of human things, being such that, save for the being who is by himself, nothing is beautiful but that which is not. Pope. I would, without any vain ornamentation surrounding the act, have poisoned myself. For my good friends, I am ripe for the send-off. There are times when we suddenly understand the hitherto unperceived meaning of certain expressions. We live them and mutter them. For example, I felt the earth giving way beneath me. This is a phrase that I have read and said 1,000 times without living it, but it was enough when I awoke to linger over it for 10 seconds as I was being visited by the memory of my arrest, the remains of last night's nightmare. For the dream element that created the expression to envelope me, or rather, to give me the sensation of internal visceral emptiness that is also caused by the precipices from which one falls at night with a feeling of certainty. I felt that way last night. No outstretched, merciful arm tries to catch me. A few rocks might perhaps offer me a stony hand, but just far enough away for me to be unable to grab it. I was falling. And in order to delay the final shock, for the feeling of falling caused me that intoxication of absolute despair, which is akin to happiness during the fall, but it was also an intoxication fearful of awakening, of the return to things that are, in order to delay the shock. At the bottom of the gulf, and the awakening in prison with my anguish at the thought of suicide, or jail. I accumulated catastrophes. I provoked accidents along the verticality of the precipice. I summoned up frightful obstacles at the point of arrival. It was the very next day that the influence of this undissipated dream made me pile up details, all of them serious, in the confused hope that they were staving off the inevitable. I was slowly sinking. Yet, back in my 426, the sweetness of my work entrances me. The first steps I take, with my hands on my hips, which seem to be pitching, make me feel as if Darling, who was walking behind, were passing through me. And here I am again in the soothing comfort of the elegant hotel, which they will have to leave, for 20,000 francs is not eternal. During his stay at the hotel, Darling had not been to the garret. He had left Divine without any news. Our dearest was dying of anxiety, so when Our Lady and he ran out of money, he thought about going back. Dressed like fake monarchs, they returned to the attic, where with blankets stolen from cars, they arranged a bed for the murderer on the rug. He slept there, near Divine and Darling. When she saw them enter, Divine thought she had been forgotten and replaced. Not at all. We shall see later the kind of incest that bound the two lads together. Divine worked for two men, one of whom was her own. Until then, she had loved only men who were stronger and just a tiny bit older and more muscular than herself. But then came Our Lady of the Flowers, who had the moral and physical character of a flower. She was smitten with him. Something different, a kind of feeling of power, sprang up in the vegetal, germinative sense in Divine. She thought she had been virilified. A wild hope made her strong and husky and vigorous. She felt muscles growing and felt herself emerging from a rock carved by Michelangelo in the form of a slave. Without moving a muscle, though straining within herself, she struggled internally just as Laocoon seizes the monster, untwists it. Then, bolder still, she wanted to box, with her arms and legs of flesh. But she very quickly got knocked about on the boulevard, for she judged and willed her movements not in accordance with their combative efficiency, but rather in accordance with an aesthetic that would have made of her a hoodlum of a more or less gallant stripe. Her movements, particularly a hitching of the belt and her guard position, were meant, whatever the cost, at the cost of victory itself, to make of her not the boxer Divine, but a certain admired boxer, and at times several fine boxers rolled into one. She tried for male gestures, which are rarely the gestures of males. She whistled, she put her hands in her pocket, and this whole performance was carried out so unskillfully that in the course of a single evening she seemed to be 4 or 5 characters at the same time. She thereby acquired the richness of a multiple personality. She ran from boy to girl, and the transitions from one to the other, because the attitude was a new one, were made stumblingly. She would hop after the boy on one foot. She would always begin her big scatterbrain gestures, then, suddenly remembering that she was supposed to show she was virile so as to captivate the murderer, she would end by burlesquing them. And this double-time formula enveloped her in strangeness, made her a timid clown in plain dress, a sort of embittered swish. Finally, to crown her metamorphosis from female into tough male, she imagined a man-to-man relationship which would link her with one of those faultless pimps whose gestures could not be regarded as ambiguous. And to be on the safe side, she invented Marchetti. It was a simple matter to choose a physique for him, for she possessed in her secret lonely girl imagination, for her night's pleasure, a stock of thighs, arms, torsos, faces, hair, teeth, neck, and knees, and she knew how to assemble them so as to make of them a live man to whom she loaned a soul, which is always the same one for each of these constructions, the one she would like to have herself. The invented Marchetti had a few adventures with her in secret. Then, one night, She told him that she was tired of Our Lady of the Flowers and that she was willing to let Marchetti have him. The agreement was sealed with a male handshake. The dream was as follows. Marchetti comes breezing into the place with his hands in his pockets. "Hello, kid," he says to Divine. He sits down, and they have a man-to-man talk about the grind. Our Lady arrives, shakes hands with Marchetti. Marchetti kids him a bit about his girl's puss. As for me, Divine is talking to herself in secret, I pretend not to see them, but I'm sure that now, thanks to me, Our Lady is going to tear off a quickie with Marchetti. He is too nice a name to need a given name. I busy myself for 3 minutes about the room. I manage it so that my back is turned to them. I turn around. I see them billing and cooing, and Marchetti's fly is open. The lovemaking begins. Divine had not become virile, she had aged. An adolescent now excited her, and that was why she had the feeling of being old, and this certainty unfurled within her like the hangings formed by the wings of bats. That evening, undressed and alone in the garret, she saw with fresh eyes her white, hairless body, smooth and dry, and in places bony. She was ashamed of it, and hastened to put out the lamp, for it was the ivory body of Jesus on an 18th century crucifix, and relations with the divinity, even a resemblance to it, sickened her. But along with this desolation, a new joy was being born within her, the joy that precedes suicides. Divine was afraid of her daily life. Her flesh and soul were turning sour. There came for her the season of tears, as we speak of the season of rains. Once she had switched off the light and created darkness. For nothing in the world would she take a step out of bed, where she thinks she is safe, but in the same way that she thinks she is safe in her body. She feels rather protected by the fact of being in her body. Outside reigns terror. One night, however, she dared open the door of the garret and take a step out on the dark landing. The stairway was filled with the wails of sirens calling her to the bottom. They were not exactly wails or songs, not exactly sirens either, but they were quite clearly an invitation to madness or to death by falling. Mad with fright, she went back to the garret. It was the moment before alarm clocks started ringing. If she was spared fears during the day, she knew another torture. She would blush. For the veriest trifle, she would become the very crimson, the purplish one, her eminence. It must not be thought that she was ashamed of her profession. She had known too well and too early how to penetrate steadily to the depths of despair, not to be, at her age, dead to all sense of shame. Calling herself an old whorish whore, Divine simply forestalled mockery and insults. But she blushed about little things which seemed trivial, which we think insignificant, until the moment when, observing more closely, she realized that the blush had spread just when someone was humiliating her unwittingly. A mere trifle humiliated Divine, the kind of humiliation which, she was again Coulafroid, laid her lower than the ground by the mere power of words. Words again took on for her the magic of boxes empty, when all is said and done, of everything that is not mystery. When closed words, sealed, hermetic words, open up, their meanings escape in leaps and bounds that assault and leave us panting. Brew, which is a word from sorcery, led me to the home of the old maid who grinds coffee, mixes in some chicory, and brews through coffee grounds. This is a trick of hocus pocus. It leads me back to sorcery. The word, Mithridate. One morning, Divine suddenly comes upon it again. It had once opened up and revealed to Coulafroid its virtue. And the child, going back up the centuries to the 1500s, buried himself in the Rome of the pontiffs. Let us take a look at this period in Divine's life. as aconite was the only potion he could procure every night in a long, stiff-pleated dressing gown. He would open the door of his room, which was on a level with the garden, would step over the railing, gesture of a lover, burglar, dancer, somnambulance, mountebank, and jump into the vegetable garden, which was bounded by a hedge of elders, mulberries, and blackthorns, but where someone had laid out, between the vegetable beds, borders of reseda and marigolds. Coulafroid would gather a bunch of Naples aconite leaves. He would measure them with a 6-inch ruler, increase the dose each time, roll them up, and then swallow. But the poison had the double virtue of killing and raising from the dead those it killed, and presto, it would act. The Renaissance would take possession of the child through the mouth, just as the man-god does of the little girl who, sticking out her tongue, though piously, swallows the host. The Borgias, astrologers, pornographers, princes, abbesses, and condottieri would receive him naked on their knees, which were hard beneath the silk. He would tenderly place his cheek against an erect penis, stony beneath the silk, of stone as unyielding as the chests of Negro jazzmen must be beneath the shiny satin of their jackets. It was in a green alcove, for feasts that end in death by daggers, scented gloves, a treacherous wafer. Beneath the moon, Coulafroid became this world of poisoners, pederasts, thieves, sorcerers, warriors, and courtesans, and the surrounding nature, the vegetable garden, remaining what they were, left him all alone, possessing and possessed by an epoch in his barefoot walk, beneath the moon, about the cabbage and lettuce beds where lay an abandoned rake and spade, left him free to lift and draw trains of brocade with lofty gestures. No episode from history or novel organized the dream mass. Only the murmur of a few magic words thickened the darkness, from which there loomed a page or horseman, a handsome coxman, disheveled by a broadcloth knight. Datura fatuosa, datura stramonomium belladonna. As the coolness of the night that fell upon his white robe would make him feel chilly, he would walk to the wide-open window, slip under the railing, close the window, and lie down in a huge bed. When day came, he was again the shy, pale schoolboy, stooping with the weight of his books. But one does not have enchanted nights without the days retaining some telltale signs, which are to the soul what circles are to the eyes. Ernestine used to dress him in very short blue serge pants, over which he wore a black schoolboy smock that buttoned down the back with white glazed buttons. She also made him wear black wooden sabots and black cotton stockings that concealed his rather thin calves. He was not in mourning for anyone, and it was touching to see him all in black. He belonged to the race of harried children, early wrinkled, volcanic. Emotions ravage faces, root out peace, swell the lips, crease the brow, and make the eyebrows quiver with shudders and subtle convulsions. His schoolmates called him Coolie, which name, uttered during their games, was a slap in the face. But children of this kind, like vagabonds, have in their bags charming or terrible tricks, by means of which they open out warm and downy havens, where they drink red wine that makes them drunk, and where they are loved in secret. Coulafroid would escape through the ceiling of the village school like a hunted thief, and among the unsuspecting schoolboys during the clandestine recreations. The child is the recreator of heaven and earth. He would meet Jean, the Black Terror. When school was over, he returned to the house nearest the school, and thus avoided having to take part in the voodoo mysteries of the schoolboys, who were freed at 4 o'clock from parents and teachers. His room was a little nook with mahogany furniture, and was decorated with colored prints of autumn landscapes, which he did not look at because the only faces he could find there were those of 3 green nymphs. Childhood wearies of the conventional myths foisted upon a conventional childhood. It doesn't care a rap about picture book fairies and decorative monsters, and my personal fairies were the slender butcher with the pointed mustache, the consumptive schoolmistress, the pharmacist. Everyone was a fairy. That is, was isolated by the halo of an unapproachable, inviolable existence, through which all I could see was gestures whose continuity, hence whose logic and element of reassurance, escaped me, and every fragment of which raised a new question for me, word by word, and disturbed me. Coulefoy would enter his room. Immediately he is in his Vatican. A sovereign pontiff. He lays his bag, which is crammed with books and pads, on a straw chair. From under the bed he pulls out a case. Old playthings pile up, torn and dogged, picture albums, a shaggy teddy bear, and from that bed of darkness, from that tomb of still fragrant and radiant glories, he pulls out a grayish violin, which he himself has made. His hesitant gesture makes him blush. He feels the humiliation, stronger than the green shame of someone spitting on your back, that he had felt while putting it together, though not while conceiving it, just about a week before, with the cardboard binding of the picture album, the piece of broom handle, and 4 white threads, the strings. It was a flat gray violin, a 2-dimensional violin, with only the soundboard and the neck and 4 white strings, geometric and rigorous, spanning the extravagance. A phantom violin. The bow was a walnut twig from which he had peeled the bark. The first time Coulefoy had asked his mother to buy him a violin, she had winced. She had been salting his soup. None of the following images had appeared before her eyes with any precision. A river, flames, escutcheoned oriflammes, a Louis XV heel, a page in blue tights. The page's craft and slyness, but the disturbance that each of them created within her, a plunge into an ink-black lake, held her for a moment between life and death. And when 2 or 3 seconds later she came to herself, a nervous shudder ran through her, which made the hand salting the soup tremble. Coulefoy did not know that a violin, because of its tortured lines, could upset his sensitive mother, and that violins moved about in her dreams in the company of lithe cats, at corners of walls, under balconies where thieves divide the night's loot, where other toughs slouch around a lamp-post, on stairways that squeak like violins being skinned alive. Ernestine wept with rage at being unable to kill her son, for Coulefoy was not what one could kill. Or rather, we can see what one killed in him made possible another birth. Rods, straps, spankings, and slaps lose their power, or rather, change their virtues. The word violin was never uttered again. In order to study music, that is, to make the same gestures as some pretty youngster in a magazine, Coulefoy made the instrument, but in front of Ernestine never again would he utter the word that begins with the same syllable as violate. The making took place in the greatest secrecy, at night. During the day, he buried it away at the bottom of the case of old toys. Every evening he took it out. With humiliation, he learned by himself how to place his left fingers on the white threads, according to the instructions in an old manual that he found in the attic. Each silent session exhausted him. The disappointing squeak that the bow tore from the strings gave his soul goose-flesh. His heart was drawn out fine and unraveled into strained silences, ghosts of sounds. His frustration haunted him throughout the lesson, and he studied in a state of constant shame. He felt shifty and humiliated, as we do on New Year's Day. Our good wishes are furtive and whispered, as among others those of proud servants and lepers must be. Since these are gestures reserved for the masters, we often feel as if we were using their wardrobes to receive each other. They embarrass us, as the unlined dress jacket must embarrass the apprentice butler who wears it. One evening, Goulafoy made a broad, extravagant traditions gesture, a gesture that went beyond the room, entered into the night, where it continued on to the stars, among the bears, and even farther. Then, like the snake that bites its tail, it returned to the shadow of the room, and into the child who drowned in it. He drew the bow from the point to the base, slowly, magnificently. This final laceration sought his soul apart. The silence, the shadow, and the hope of separating these diverse elements, which fell away generally, thus dashed to the ground in attempt at construction. He let his arms drop, and the violin and the bow. He wept like a child. The tears ran down his flat little face. Once again he realized it was all hopeless. The magic net through which he had tried to gnaw tightened about him, isolating him. With a feeling of utter emptiness, he went to the little mirror of the dresser and looked at his face, for which he felt the tenderness one feels for a homely little dog when that dog is one's own. The shadow, which had somehow slipped into the room, installed itself. Goulafoy let it be. All that interested him was the face in the mirror and its changes, the globes of the luminous eyes, the halo of shadow, the black spot of the mouth, the illuminated forefinger that supported his bent head. His head was bent so that he could see himself in the mirror, but he had to raise his eyes, and this made him observe himself in the sly way that actors do in films. I might be a great artist. He did not formulate this idea clearly. Nevertheless, the splendor involved in it made him lower his head a little more. The weight of destiny, he thought. In the gleaming rosewood of the dresser, he saw a fleeting scene, similar in essence to many others that often visited him. A small boy was crouching beneath a barred window, in a dark room, where he himself was walking about, with his hands in his pockets. Capitals rose up from his sandy childhood, capitals like cactuses beneath the sky, cactuses like green suns, radiating pointed rays and steeped in poison. His childhood, like a Sahara, quite tiny or immense, we don't know. A childhood sheltered by the light, the scent and the flow of personal charm of a huge flowering magnolia that rose into a sky deep as a grotto above the invisible though present sun. This childhood was withering on its broiling sand, with, in moments swift as pencil strokes, and as thin as a paradise one sees between the eyelids of a Mongol, a glimpse of the invisible and present magnolia. These moments were at all points like those of which the poet speaks. I saw in the desert your open sky.